Margaret Tudor, contrary to many expectations, became the second wife of the Scottish Earl of Angus, but their union quickly turned into a nightmare. As a result of this marriage, she was forced to relinquish most of her powers and, ultimately, fled back to England with the help of her brother, King Henry VII. After spending a year away from home, Margaret returned to her homeland to be near her husband, but before leaving, she made a troubling discovery. This was the first recorded birth of a daughter from the Tudor dynasty in England. Margaret was born in 1489. She was the second child, but the first girl in the family. Her brothers were more numerous, and boys were considered more desirable for marriage and succession. However, Margaret's parents did not regard her with the unfriendly contempt one might expect, as they were pleased with her birth, although their reason for happiness was quite noteworthy. Margaret's father, King Henry VIII, was not yet fully secure in his reign, having seized the throne by killing his predecessor. Therefore, he could not confidently claim to be the true monarch by divine right and legitimacy. His main strategy was to maintain good relations with other European states, as domestic stability was still fragile. Such diplomatic measures often involved royal marriages with foreign courts, making the wedding of children a common practice among royal families. Little Margaret grew up in the luxurious chambers of Eltham Palace, surrounded by younger brothers and a sister. Among them was the famous Henry VIII, who would later become King of England, and his sister Mary, who would eventually ascend the throne of France as queen. At that time, European monarchs readily arranged marriages with young children, as these unions strengthened political alliances and secured future options for succession. Before she was 6 years old, Margaret was promised a consanguineous marriage to King James IV of Scotland, then 22 years old. This treaty would have established lasting peace between England and Scotland, a key diplomatic goal of the time. Already, long-standing conflicts between the two kingdoms persisted, and such an alliance could have significantly changed the course of history. However, advisors feared that marrying such a young princess to a more mature Scottish king might lead Scotland to seize the English throne or enhance its position at England's expense. At the age of 12, Margaret officially married James IV through a so-called representative ceremony, without the groom present, a common practice when one of the spouses could not attend the wedding in person. Part 2 of 9. Although Margaret remained in England for 2 more years after this marriage, she was officially called the Queen of Scotland, which indicated serious plans and expectations regarding her future role. At only 14 years old, her mother, Queen Elizabeth of Jordan, delivered an important piece of news that was destined to change the fate of the young princess and her family. The birth of a child who lived only a few days marked the first blow to the royal family's destiny. Later, about a week later in June, the world was shaken by another tragic event, the death of Queen Elizabeth. Soon after, Queen Margaret faced more trials. This was related to the loss of her mother, Margaret herself, which made her life even more filled with difficulties and changes. Following the instructions and legacy of her father, she traveled to Edinburgh, where on August 8, 1503, one of the most significant ceremonies of her life took place, her marriage. On that day, Margaret married King James IV at the magnificent grounds of Holyrood Abbey. This union was a pinnacle of her tumultuous and difficult life. Despite the age difference, James was significantly older than Margaret, which might seem unusual. If one had to choose from noble contenders, he would surely be the preferred choice, charismatic, wealthy, and lively. He did not waste time hurriedly dismounting from his horse via the ladder like many others, but rather sat straight on the saddle, which delighted the people of Scotland. They joyfully watched as his bride decided to join him and ride together along the roads en route to Edinburgh. Such an act seemed very charming and endearing. During the married years with King James IV, Margaret had 6 children. Unfortunately, only one, a boy named James, lived to adulthood. All the other babies tragically died in infancy, a heavy hardship for any mother's heart. The most significant event in Margaret's life was her bitter consolation. On April 21st, 1509, her father, King Henry VIII, passed away at the age of 52 from tuberculosis. This fateful departure brought unexpected changes to Margaret's life and to the history of all of Britain. After Henry's death, his younger brother Henry VII ascended the throne of England, and with his accession, everything began to change. The peace between England and Scotland suddenly started to crumble. Peace treaties that once united these countries began to disintegrate, giving way to conflicts and hostility. England increasingly engaged in war with France, an old ally of Scotland, which only heightened the tension. It was not long before the unrest reached a breaking point. Soon, the King of England and the King of Scotland found themselves on opposite sides of a brutal and bloody struggle. At the same time, Margaret faced her own personal dramas. Part 3 of 9. Dark premonitions began to emerge, obsessive nightmares she believed to be omens. According to legend, she dreamt of Jacob falling from a great height, a symbolic vision of forthcoming trials. In September, on the 9th day of the year 1513, Margaret sat in her palace hall in London, anxiously awaiting news about her husband's fate, Jacob IV, experiencing the full range of emotions, as she understood that a difficult struggle for the future lay ahead. The bottle of chaos and treachery, unleashed during those fateful days, became Margaret's most terrifying and cruel test. Soon after conflict and combat erupted, fate decreed a bitter end for her. Along with 10,000 Scots, her beloved James rushed into battle to fight for his lands and honor. However, this heroic act ended in tragedy. He was brutally killed by English forces. In memory of her painful loss, Margaret's sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, managed to retrieve James's blood-stained cloak from his blood and sent it to her husband, King Henry III, as a sign of love and grief. While her husband and head of state died prematurely, and the heir to the throne, the young Prince James, was still an infant, it was during this difficult and tragic period that Margaret became regent of Scotland. She took upon herself the governance of the country in the name of the unborn boy until he reached an age capable of ruling independently. All of this was clearly stipulated in the will of the late king, which prescribed that Margaret could rule only until the heir reached majority. Contrary to established rules, the court strongly resisted the woman's authority. Many engaged in difficult debates. Some hesitated, reluctant to allow a woman to govern the state, while others outright rejected such a possible precedent. Meanwhile, Margaret herself found herself in a complex situation as her brother, who was secretly or overtly involved in James's death, was strongly opposed to her rule. This period became a true test for a woman at the center of events. Intrigue, distrust, and power struggles raged around her. Most painfully, she endured a personal drama. She was on the brink of motherhood, expecting a child amidst universal tension. In the spring following her husband's death, Margaret gave birth to Scotland's last king, a son named Alexander. Despite all her personal tragedies and power struggles, she managed to find the strength and heart to fall in love. During this difficult time, amid intrigue, wars, and personal grief, a feeling took hold of her completely. Interestingly, her chosen one was a young man named Archibald Bell, the Cat, whom, according to his own family, was considered a frivolous and reckless person. Yet, this passion overwhelmed Margaret to madness. In August of the year 1414, she hurriedly ran away with him, deciding to abandon all her obligations and the crown for love. This act sparked a true rebellion and chaos. According to King James's will, Margaret could only rule until her son reached 18, and only if she remained a widow. In other words, she essentially relinquished the crown to marry the young man. However, her new beloved proved not to be quite what he appeared at first glance. Despite the festivities and gifts surrounding her, Archibald Bell Douglas was someone whom Margaret, it seemed, had feelings for from the very beginning. He was already engaged or, according to some accounts, even married to another woman. As a result, Margaret's position after the wedding changed dramatically. Her popularity and power rapidly declined, and the previously supportive court now turned against her aggressively. Steadfastly continuing to fight for her right and love, Margaret faced the ferocity of palace intrigues and pressure that threatened to completely destroy her hopes of further reign. Soon afterward, her power was overthrown. The king was forced to relinquish the throne, and a new figure took the throne, wielding control over the country according to their own rules. During these events, Margaret found herself in a very difficult situation. She was accused of losing her country to others. In this context, it was especially painful for her to learn that the court insisted she leave her sons, James and Alexander, in the custody of the new rulers. That sense of helplessness, having to hand her children over to strangers, was a crushing blow to her heart. Ultimately, feeling cornered, Margaret made a decisive decision to transfer her sons to the new ruler of Scotland. Soon after, she made the difficult choice to leave the country altogether, seeking to escape constant surveillance and pressure from the new authorities. At such a moment, she reached out for help to someone she probably did not trust deeply, her brother Henry. He became her savior during this tough period, helping her flee Scotland and escape the wrath of the new ruler. However, it cannot be said that her brother's intentions were entirely noble. His support was motivated by pragmatic considerations. At that time, Margaret was his heiress, and his goal was to maintain power and influence. Additionally, the situation was complicated by the fact that Margaret was pregnant by her second husband during her escape. While she was trying to leave the country, she was under pressure not only from the political upheavals, but also because she carried a new child inside her. Throughout the flight and the entire period that followed, she could not count on her husband's support, as he preferred to stay in Scotland to please the new rulers who had seized power. Soon after the birth of her daughter, whom she named Margaret, Margaret's condition became so severe that she could not endure travel. The circumstances continued to worsen. She received terrible news. Her son Alexander, whom she loved dearly, did not reach his second birthday. This tragedy broke her heart, and in a fit of despair, she publicly accused Duke Alban of killing the child, claiming that he had poisoned her little son. After these tragic events, Margaret spent a great deal of time traveling, trying to find even a moment of peace. However, her tranquility was short-lived, as the political situation prevented her from remaining in relative safety for long. During this time, as always, the man she considered an ally, her brother Henry, continued to pursue power, knowing it was crucial for her to stay close and influence her son, the future king. This plan was politically important to secure advantageous relations with England and strengthen their position in Scotland and on the international stage. By Margaret's 41st birthday, she was back in her homeland, and her life could change dramatically. Her second husband, Wallace Douglas, continued his secrets and intrigues. He carried on an affair with a long-forgotten mistress and lived in luxury, paying little regard to her interests. All of this was at her expense, since the expenses were charged to her name. Upon learning of her husband's infidelity and behavior, which threatened their marriage and safety, Margaret immediately began proceedings for divorce. However, at that historical period, the 16th century, this process was very complicated and lengthy, as laws and bureaucratic procedures delayed it for years. It was during this time that she faced new trials, and her life continued to change, threatening her future and her position. When the destructive split between the land, called the Devastated, and its inhabitants occurred, Margaret fought with all her strength for her right to divorce. While she tried to free herself from his control and gain independence, Douglas was controlling her finances. He kept her lands under his guardianship and hindered her ability to participate in her son's affairs. Moreover, in recent years, Douglas and his allies seized power in the Scottish government. This made him a formidable opponent, very difficult to remove. However, Margaret devised clever moves to outwit her enemies. When Douglas and his henchmen took control of the state, they expelled the Earl of Albany, then Margaret's enemy. At that time, Albany and Margaret were in conflict, but over time, their interests aligned, and in November 1521, Margaret boldly organized a coup against her own husband. He was humiliatingly dethroned and stripped of all his titles. Douglas could only watch as his wife triumphantly entered Edinburgh, walking alongside the Duke of Albany, the man who had once been their common enemy. To some, the situation seemed as if Margaret had made peace with her former adversary a little too easily. Rumors spread that the Queen of Scotland was supposedly having an affair with her new ally, but she was involved in much darker schemes. She soon discovered that a real spy had infiltrated her household. Her friend, Sister Isabella Hop Pringle, was suspected. This woman exploited her closeness to the Queen to pass Scottish secrets to the English side, especially during periods of heightened tension between England and Scotland. When there was a threat that Irish nobility and discontented courtiers might punish both her and the monastery, Margaret herself intervened to save her friend. In response, Isabella was ordered to cease her spying activities and remain solely loyal to her. However, she continued secretly working for the English, providing intelligence that made her a double agent. Perhaps this is why there is a sense that mutual estrangement between England and Scotland is once again taking hold. For a long time, both sides engaged in conflicts, nearly waging war, then cooled off and retreated once more. Behind closed doors, diplomats wrote notes to each other, and disputes simmered for years, until finally their son, King James V, was able to bring an end to these upheavals and diplomatic games. In 1524, Margaret ascended to the throne. However, even after her son was proclaimed king, she continued her struggle to maintain her power and independence. Despite her official status and outward stability, her internal battles were far from over. The first military and political challenge was her husband, the distant and fiercely uncompromising Archbishop John Balliol, better known as Archbishop Douglas. This man, who had previously experienced a separation from Margaret and was rejected by her, continued to cause trouble despite King Henry VII's personal efforts to reconcile the spouses, hoping to reunite their relationship. But Margaret still sought a divorce, and over the years, she managed to free herself from her husband's influence, expelling him from governance, sending him into exile in 2 different countries, and even threatening to start a full-scale war to rid herself of his authority. It was clear that her feelings for him had long faded, and her resolve to seek independence was unmistakable. Nevertheless, King Henry perceived her reluctance to reinstate Douglas as a challenge, and to strengthen his position, he extended an invitation to Douglas, asking him to come and attempt to revive relations with his sister. When Margaret, firmly refusing to reconcile with Douglas, declared her unwavering stance, her hostile and power-hungry husband, the Archbishop decided to act. He and his supporters soon launched a military campaign aimed at storming the Scottish Parliament, the Sessi, and attempted to seize power to eliminate Margaret's influence and that of her son, King James. At that time, in order to strengthen her position and suppress resistance, Margaret turned to her long-standing ally, the Duke of Albany. In a letter, she openly stated that she was working with him and intended to oppose England before agreeing to restore relations with Douglas. However, this message was intercepted by the most inappropriate person, Margaret's brother, King Henry VII. He issued such a severe reprimand that, afraid of the possible consequences, she changed her mind, began to play by his rules, and resumed a friendly attitude toward Douglas. Once in power, Douglas used his authority as much as possible to achieve his goals. When he was entrusted with the guardianship of 14-year-old James, future Scottish king, in 1526, he made an attempt to draw the young king into his orbit and turn him away from his mother, Margaret. He essentially kidnapped the young monarch, withholding him from her, and kept him in his own hands, hindering his return to his mother. Margaret desperately tried to save her son, making various efforts, but all proved unsuccessful. Ultimately, the 14-year-old king was forced to escape on his own, leaving his stepfather's house after 3 agonizing years spent there. Upon the long-anticipated reunion with his mother, James was deeply shaken. Much had changed during his absence. Firstly, he saw that his mother had found a new lover, a Scottish nobleman named Henry Stuart. Starting from 1524, the queen began surrounding her chosen one with luxury and titles, bestowing honors and privileges upon him in every way. This new passion undoubtedly changed her appearance and lifestyle, making her more determined in her actions and intentions. Events unfolded rapidly, and soon after the nobility's elders began to harbor dissatisfaction, Margaret started living openly with her new consort, who was already officially called Lord Menzies. Previously, she was a regular participant in the Scottish court, rarely attending Parliament, and rumors suggested she was likely hiding a premarital pregnancy. At that moment, she desperately needed a divorce. The situation had reached a critical point, and Margaret realized she had little choice but to resort to her last trump card. Her luck was that marriages and breakups within the royal family sometimes depended on chance and circumstances. In her case, a very significant factor was the difference in the status of her husbands. When she and her second husband, Douglas, tied the knot, he was already engaged to another woman. As a result, Margarita was able to obtain a divorce, finally freeing herself from this burdensome attachment. After the dissolution of this union, she immediately decided to remarry, this time to Lord Meswin. Unfortunately, he proved to be even more inclined to infidelity and extravagance than her second husband. He grew close to his mistress, and like Douglas, both he and his chosen one continued to live at Margarita's expense. These circumstances became part of the reasons why, roughly 10 years after their wedding, she once again sought a divorce. In May 1528, a new estrangement began between her and her then-husband, King James VI. During this period, he began managing state affairs on his own, but Margarita had no involvement in his political actions. Moreover, their personal relationship noticeably deteriorated as they hardly got along. When they had to face each other directly, she was indignant that he refused her a divorce from her other husband, and she also complained about the lack of financial support from the king. However, in reality, the cause of their separation was Margarita herself. She was caught passing state secrets related to her son to her rival, King Henry VII of England. In 1543, in despair, Margarita launched long campaigns to regain custody of her youngest child, Lady Margarita Douglas. This young woman grew up in the English court, following her mother's example, and also became embroiled in scandals. She had a romantic affair with a courtier, which resulted in her imprisonment in the Tower. After her release, she remained at her uncle's court, but her fate continued to be intertwined with political intrigues and family conflicts. Many years earlier, she had not seen her mother again, and overall, it can be said that Margaret Tudor neither excelled in discerning people's characters nor possessed high political acumen. In her later years, she often irritated those around her, including her influential brother and son, which gradually diminished her authority and influence. Although Margaret and James reconciled towards the end of their lives, their shared happy years were few. Sometime after suffering a stroke, Margaret Tudor died on October 18, 1541, at the age of only 51. Despite Margaret calling her son James by phone, he, unfortunately, failed to arrive quickly at her bedside and was not present at her death. She completed her life quietly and peacefully, without the presence of loved ones. The story of Margaret Tudor left a noticeable mark. Perhaps it was she who introduced King Henry VII to the idea of legalizing divorce. When Henry heard that his sister was so frivolously disregarding the sacred vows of marriage, he was deeply shocked. He even once remarked that it was impossible to lead a more disgraceful life than Margaret's. Through years of struggle, separation, and reconciliation, she ultimately received the final smile of fortune. Her legacy proved to be enduring. Queen Margaret Tudor, frankly speaking, left quite a significant reputation behind. In history, she is remembered not only as the sister of King Henry VII, but also as a figure who influenced the fate of royal dynasties. Some even believe that Margaret was the initiator of the idea of divorce in English-Scottish history, marking an important step during an era of religious and political upheaval. In the end, her children and grandchildren, thanks to her legacy, ascended to the throne. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland, was Margaret's great-granddaughter, and her grandson James was her direct ancestor, inheriting the English and Scottish crowns. Thus, the current British royal family, despite its seemingly impeccable reputation, traces its roots back to that scandalous and remarkable woman, Margaret Tudor. Her life and actions became vital building blocks in the foundation of the modern British monarchy.